At Suffolk University. I'm Jen Bernardi. I'm the executive director of the Ford Hall Forum, where the speakers enlighten the audience and the audience challenges the speakers. Thank you tonight for joining us at Bittersweet Humanitarianism with Ashley Judd. Before we begin, I'd like to thank the forum's generous sponsors, including, among others, Altria, the Lowell Institute, the Massachusetts Cultural Council, all of our fantastic sponsors at the upcoming First Amendment Award reception, and our partners here at Suffolk University who give the forum access to innumerable services, including this very theater. We also thank the members of the Ford Hall Forum. Your support means everything to us. Allow me to introduce our esteemed moderator for tonight's forum, Candelaria Silva. Candelaria is a facilitator, consultant, published writer, reviewer, and essayist. Currently, she is a marketing consultant for Door to Door to the Arts and creates a seasonal calendar of arts and cultural events for senior citizens. Silva's professional experience includes being the first director for ACT Roxbury, a cultural economic development program. Through it, she conceived and developed the Roxbury International Film Festival, the Roxbury Literary Annual, the Roxbury Discussion Series, and more. She also played a major role in the creation of the Roxbury Center for the Arts at Hibernian Hall. Please give a warm welcome for Candelaria Silva.
Welcome, everyone, and thank you. And I want to say a special thanks first to Tessel, and he knows why. Ashley Judd is an actor, author, and humanitarian activist. She serves as a board member and global ambassador for Youth AIDS, a prevention program of Population Services International. As an activist, Judd has addressed the General Assembly of the United Nations, spoken at the National Press Club, testified before the Senate Foreign Relations, and served as an expert panelist at the Clinton Global Initiative. She is also active with Women for Women International, Equality Now, and other non-governmental organizations that focus on multifaceted support for underserved populations. She is the author of the riveting memoir, All That Is Bitter and Sweet, that bears witness to her childhood, acting, and humanitarian activism. Please join me in welcoming a very special human being, Ashley Judd. I wanted to say a couple things and then get started. The way we're going to work tonight is I'm going to ask you a few questions, and then we're going to open it up to the audience. Ms. Judd, reading this book, it was clear that you had some rain in your life. It was clear that you suffered and witnessed pain, that you felt a lot of indignation and about the atrocities against women and children in the world, as well as something that you suffered, that your anger fueled you into action, and that you believe in change, that people have the capacity to change. You're also very, very clear about your values, and I will say that that's one of the things that I wasn't expecting, is how clear you were about your values. There's no gossip in the book. I kept reading for some, but I didn't see it. There's no dish. And there's no how you met Dario, which I was also looking for in the book. It's more than a memoir. What was the catalyst for the book? Was it your humanitarian social justice work? Was it the therapy you had? Was it your journaling? What got you to do it?
Well, first of all, good evening. It's lovely to meet you, and I'm pleased to be in this esteemed and venerable hall. I really am grateful for the opportunity to talk about my values. And the catalyst was a certain morning in July when Musakoa, who at the time was the Minister of Gender Affairs in Cambodia and has since gone on to be a member of the opposition government and be nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize, said to her colleague, "Let's take this Hollywood light into the darkest place of hell." And they drove me to Savay Pak, the notorious child brothel district outside Phnom Penh. So into hell they took me indeed. And I didn't know what to do except to simply be. And my values kicked in immediately because there's a prayer from Father Thomas Merton, who was at the Abbey of Gethsemane in Western Kentucky, in which he wrote, "I don't know where I'm going. I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know where it's all going to lead, but I believe, in fact, that the desire to please you does please you." So I also have been taught that listening is an act of courage and can lead to transformation. So I simply began to listen. And my mother is a nurse. She's a greatly empathetic woman, and she's taught me to, and this may sound like a strange comparison, but when you're in a brothel, the frame of reference is weird. To treat everyone with dignity, kindness, and respect. And if the person is in a wheelchair, to get down on my knees so I can look them in the eye. If the person has burns all over them, to, not flinch and look away. So I just started looking people, I sat down, I started looking people in the eye and saying, what do you want me to know? What is your story? How did you end up here? Where were you before? How did you get that scar on your face? Well, the man who was raping me to break me in to make me a sex slave had a dog maul my face while he was raping me. That's how I got this scar. So I listened to one person and held them, and then scooted on my bottom to the next person. And at the end of the day, although I had no idea what had just happened, I had changed my life. And that would be what I would do and how I would conduct myself over the next 6 years in 13 countries around the world. And when we finished in Svepak, the Population Services International staff, all of whom worldwide is local, took me to the Genocide Museum in Phnom Penh. I was like, where was I in social studies when this was taught? Well, guess what? It wasn't. And so walking into that Genocide Museum began the next phase of my education about the conduct and sometimes the misdeeds of the United States government abroad. And when I was back in my hotel room, I just didn't know what to do. It was like I couldn't eat. I was just turning in these useless little half circles. I didn't know where to put the information. My brain was flooded. My heart was broken. And being somewhat compulsive about the internet, I checked my email, place to start. And I had a very innocent, friendly email from a lovely friend at home who always supports me and prays for me when I travel. And she's a chef, so she's interested in food. And she was like, gosh, is there any Starbucks yet? And it was just the question I needed to piss me off. And with indignation, one of my favorite words, boy, did you hit it. I just started to write back, no, there's not any Starbucks, but there's intergenerational trauma and widespread sexual exploitation and starvation as a result of malnutrition. And by the way, there's plenty of food. There's just a failure of political will and lack of infrastructure to distribute it. And she wrote me back and she encouraged me. And the next day I wrote again. And the day after that I wrote. And then this routine emerged where I would get up in the morning and say my prayers. I would fortify myself as best I could, go out into the world, and then come back into the hotel and almost rock, and just write. And it takes about 2 hours to canonize everything that's been shared with me during the day. And all of a sudden I had 650 pages, a publisher, and a book.
Okay. What are your hopes for the memoir? What do you want it to do?
Just change the world. Nothing grandiose. Just change the world. That's all.
Okay, that's all? Okay. In the book, you'll see she has a lot of humor, but that indignation and that anger and the fire came through a lot. You talk, the commonality of women's and children's experiences are sexual exploitation and violence. Please talk about this commonality and your sense of connectedness to all these various different people that you met.
I believe that the heart beats the same under the skin, and that I heard this expression recently, and I liked it a lot. At the point of our pain, we are all the same. I don't think that my experience of pain is any different than another person's. And the circumstances in which I was raised were very different. I do have a strong sense of identification with other folks who suffer. And when I started the work in 2004, I didn't yet have any command or mastery over my own trauma. It was very unresolved. I was carrying a lot of childhood grief in particular. And it's interesting because it's precisely because of the way in which I was raised in a family system that at times didn't work particularly well, that gave me the capacity to endure such emotional extremes. Has anybody seen Bug? I have a strange aptitude for emotional extremes. Do you have a spouse? Is she scared of you now? And it's a really interesting, it might be one way to put it, movie. And I'm attracted to that. And there's a reason why I'm attracted to it, because I was raised in that kind of emotional extremity. And what the point of transformation became, what the opportunity was to continue working in settings of emotional extremity and to have mastery over my own trauma, so that I could choose to expose myself to vicarious traumatization, which absolutely happens in a refugee camp, while not re-triggering my own woundedness. Mm-hmm. Not an easy task. It's quite simple, but it's not easy.
Okay. One of the things you also said was, my vocation is to make my life an act of worship. Will you share how your spirituality and your faith grounds you, informs you, and perhaps pushed you toward the work that you do? Because I could really see it a lot. I don't know.
It's everything to me. It's everything. And especially at a time like this, when it's Friday of the week that the book came out, and a lot of people haven't read it yet, so they themselves have not been exposed to the actual content.
Yes.
And there is a tempest in a teacup about the family piece, about my remarks about rape culture, and the way it's all going. You know, it's like I've never had anything go viral before, and what a thing to have go viral, you know? It's like, wow, not exactly what I had in mind. Are you sure you've got me, you don't have me confused with somebody else? But if I, you know, like one of the things I did in New York when my mother and my sister have this show that's premiering this week, the timing is just really uncanny. So I just shut off the world, you know, and started to listen to one of Father Tutu's book on tape. And as soon as I hear his little voice at the beginning of each chapter saying, "Dear child of God," I go, okay, because that's what I am, that's what you are, and that's what this is all about. And it helps everything else go away. All the nonsense that can get so loud and large, and just remind me that, you know, love is the answer. Whatever the question, love is the answer. And I've been thinking a lot recently about where that started for me. And I remember in college studying a piece of scripture that suggests that we pray without ceasing. And one of the boards on which I serve is of Shaker Village in Mount Pleasant, Kentucky. And of course, the Shakers sought to make their work an act of worship, and their craftspersonship was an expression of order and beauty in the universe. And, you know, I am definitely not cool. I know that about myself. I live in rural Middle Tennessee. I spend my time in Scotland. I don't get invited to a lot of parties. But fortunately, I don't care all that much most of the time. Because I know that I'm a spiritual being having a human experience, as C.S. Lewis put it. Mm-hmm. And if I can hang out in that space, I'm going to be okay.
Okay. All right. Well, you would seem to me that you would get invited to any party you wanted. But again, we look at people externally and we think we know them, and we really don't. And that's a mistake we made. In the book, I don't remember if it was you or your yoga teachers, you prayed for the spiritual wisdom to have discernment between empathy and enmeshment.
Right.
And I'm going to repeat that, between empathy and enmeshment. And that was something that really struck me. Have you achieved this, do you think?
To varying degrees. You know, there's that wonderful Gandhi quote about how we find ourselves through losing ourselves in service to others. And essentially the conclusion of the prayer of St. Francis says the same thing. Do not mix that up with codependency, which is a dysfunctional loss of self. And when I first got into recovery and I started to hear things like, self-care isn't selfish, it's self-esteem, I had to start back at the beginning of the journey of discovering what healthy self-esteem really is and means. So the quote that I bring into as companions for those others is from Rabbi Hillel, and I use that in the book. And I had a class at Harvard that was, the entire syllabus was about this quote. If I am not for myself, who will be for me? I have to take a stand on my own behalf. I have to advocate my own best interests. But if I stop there, the quote goes on to say, if I'm only for myself, what am I? What am I? Not who. What am I? And if not now, when? That fierce urgency of now that President Kennedy talked about so eloquently.
Yeah, there was another quote within that chapter where it says, there is a God and it's not you.
Isn't that great?
And
Which, by the way, means it's also not any of you.
Yeah. But sometimes in doing the work, you want to be so effective, and you think, if I can think of this thing, you were really compelled. You wanted to make people better, particularly when you started as the Global Ambassador for Population Service International. They are a non-governmental organization that does incredible work. You resisted their initial overtures. You sort of tested them to see what they were really about. And it struck me when you said, and I could see it in the book, that PSI is not a rescue organization, because I think initially that idea of feeling like, could I be God? Not feeling like I could be, but can I do God's work? And you had to know that you couldn't rescue every single person who wanted you to, or change every situation you witnessed. How have you, if you want to talk a little bit about that and also about PSI?
The section in particular to which you're making reference was my second round in brothels, also in Southeast Asia. And I'd been able to have a pretty lengthy conversation with adult sex slaves who were articulate about their situation. And one woman in particular, who I ended up calling my farm friend, was very new to sex slavery. She was from a rural part of Thailand, and her husband had left her, and she was unskilled. She had no way of generating income. Because she had been abandoned by her husband, she was then rejected by her family. And so on the verge of starving to death, she began a very typical migration process, looking for work either at a garment factory or in one of the larger cities of Thailand. She couldn't find any work whatsoever, and eventually another woman on the street guided her toward the red light area. So she began to make the choiceless choice of forced prostitution for sheer economic survival, and did that for a while, was able to squirrel away a little money, which meant she was very crafty because it's difficult to do. And she left the brothel and went home, but within a month or so, she was right back in the same situation. The cupboard was bare, the boy was hungry. She still had no skills, and the day that I met her was her first day back in that brothel. So she had made the choiceless choice twice. And I was sitting in a small circle with these women, and when I would let go of her hand to hold someone else's hand, she would clutch the side of my pants. And she was so beautiful, and she still smelled fresh. You know, she hadn't been so defiled yet. Mm-hmm. And when I left that brothel, I was panicking. I mean, I was just panicking. And in this thing that I see sometimes when I close my eyes, there was a white man. He was greasy as hell. And he had his arm up on the wall, towering over a girl who was sitting in a plastic chair. You know, and I think of those chairs when I drive around rural Middle Tennessee or Eastern Kentucky, and you sit out on a nice evening, read the evening newspaper, or you know, have a glass of tea, maybe doze off. And it was one of those kind of chairs, and it was just so sordid. And I thought, well, I'm either going to kill him or myself. But then I won't be of any use to anybody. So I have to figure something out. And I wanted us at PSI to go in and rescue those women, and I started concocting these elaborate plots in my mind, and Kate, my colleague, talked me down. And I started to learn, however uncomfortably, the difference between a public health organization and a sex slavery abolition organization. And PSI, is very generous with me. They don't try to constrain my activities or limit them just to PSI. I started to work with sex slavery prevention and abolition organizations, and do so to this day around the world.
So that gets into the conversation about gender inequality and how it is implicated in every obstacle to peace and poverty alleviation. Can you talk about that? It really struck me over and over again. And then also that sense of connectedness, that women all over the world, children all over the world, have this vulnerability. So would you like to talk a little bit?
Well, when you were saying that, a story comes to mind about a young woman in forced prostitution in Nairobi I met named Shola, and her story is a classic example because it can be examined by me or by anybody through the lens of legal disempowerment, a lack of land tenure, a lack of voice in the courts, lack of access to education, cultural constructions of gender that make a girl in a household do the chores, fetch the firewood, fetch the water. The lack of sanitation and hygiene in schools that means when a girl starts her period, she often stops attending school because there's nothing for her to do about her personal hygiene and her menses. Lack of availability of modern family planning. You know, she got pregnant at a young age by a boyfriend. So her story can be looked at through any of those angles, and gender inequality inheres in the conversation of her life from her birth until this present day. Okay. And therefore, equally, because it's abusive to point out a problem without also highlighting a solution, there are multiple levers in her life that can be pressed. There are multiple opportunities to help her have those transformations that lead from victimhood to survivorhood, whether it's some education, empowering her health, which is absolutely the most elemental building block of a productive society.
Okay. One of the things, as you start talking about solutions, that was one of the things that I appreciated, because sometimes it got so dark and painful in the book that I'm like, okay, what's going well? So I thought I would throw out a couple to you. One was Project Life. The other was Umuganda, the custom in Rwanda, which really struck me. I don't know if you could talk a little bit about that. And then the Nagar trucking point, that experience.
There are so many simple, cost-effective, creative, incredibly appealing grassroots solutions that disrupt cycles of poverty and violence. And I was just talking with someone, he's got this great blog, he calls himself the Recovering Politician. And he was asking me what I think in the U.S. government works. And I said, absolutely USAID. It was an agency that was very neglected. It had a lot of bureaucratic lethargy during the previous administrations and is now being revitalized by the new administrator. And there was a poll recently that revealed some interesting misconceptions amongst the American public. The question asked, how much do you think of our budget we spend on foreign assistance? And in some instances, the answer was over 30%. We spend less than 1%, less than 1%. And the money goes to things like Project Life. Or there was one in particular, you asked about, let me give an example of what the USAID dollars can do for poor people. Teresa and Victor, a married couple in peri-urban Kinshasa, Congo, and they have a very romantic story. He says that he saw her drawing water from the river one day when they were both quite young, and he said, I'm going to marry her someday. And that, in fact, he did, and they've had a lot of children together. They were not able to regulate their fertility at all. And in addition to 8 babies, she's had 4 miscarriages that almost killed her, and at times she went to friends looking for different herbal remedies to induce a pregnancy termination, made her violently ill. And she's also afraid to leave her house because of the rape culture in Congo. So she was reached by door-to-door health workers funded by USAID through PSI, who visited with her in her home about her options for modern family planning. And Victor is so protective, he thought that this was some sort of a trick, or that they might have unintended health consequences. So he walked with her to a brick and mortar PSI clinic. And now they are very happy practitioners of long-lasting, reversible, modern family planning. Now, that hasn't stopped their diarrheal disease because they don't have safe drinking water. They still don't eat more than 1 meal a day. But at least she is not having the incredible strain and wear and tear on her body of these unintended pregnancies, and she has more energy and time to devote to looking after their 8 children and trying to figure out some vocational training so she can generate a little bit of income.
Okay. And what about the practice in Rwanda that you saw?
Right. Well, as you know, Rwanda is a post-genocidal country, and it's not just the genocide of '94. That was the culmination of a long, long series of genocides. I mean, there's a reason why President Kagame was born and raised in a refugee camp in Uganda. Same with the great Eloise Nyumba, a wonderful senator who's done remarkable things for her country. And when President Kagame brought her back out of the camps in Uganda, he asked her to be the Minister of Reconciliation. And so she brought back the Kagachi courts so that people could sit in community and kind of on that model of the public truth and reconciliation hearings post-apartheid that Archbishop Tutu organized, have their truth-telling and their catharsis and reconciliation. So a Hutu can today live next door to a Tutsi who's, where there has been incidents of murder between them. And the Umaganda is another community building effort. Once a month? I think it's once a month. Mm-hmm. The entire nation comes to a screeching halt, and every single Rwandan participates in community service. They build genocide widows' homes. They work on rural health clinics. They work on schools. They do beautification schemes. And it is one of the most intensively cultivated countries in the world. It has the highest population density in sub-Saharan Africa, which is really saying something. And so they work on water and irrigation products. They've got terrible erosion problems. So they just try to make it better. They try to make it better. And, Rwanda is a remarkable country. Most sub-Saharan African countries are not going to meet the Millennium Development Goals. Rwanda is one that is. And it's a country that doesn't have mineral wealth, which is really, really interesting. Even though President Kagame still tells me that the conflict minerals they have are from them, I don't really believe it. But anyway, that's a whole other subject.
Okay, all right.
He looks so hurt when he goes, Ashley, you think we're exporting Congolese There's no press here, right? I don't want to get in trouble.
I don't know. There might be somebody, but are you planning to write any more books, and what's next for you in terms of both the work and the movies? When I started the book, I thought you had left entertainment forever, but now I hear that's not exactly true.
Well, I want to be a White House fellow.
Okay.
But somehow or another, I've ended up starring in a series for ABC instead.
Okay. All right. But I'm sure it's calculated. There's a reason it's that particular series, and what you have.
I wonder if it's too late to get out of it now, though.
Probably. It's been announced. But are you writing, continuing to write? Do you see other kinds of books in you? Have you thought about fiction or a straight nonfiction book that hasn't?
I definitely love to write. I enjoy it. My editor's here. She can attest that I love to write because, boy, I'm nothing if not voluminous. A lot of material pours out of me. And there are more ways to die than simply to stop breathing, and to disengage from service work to me would absolutely be a death. And if I'm going to keep traveling, I'm going to keep writing, because it is a strategy for commemorating the sacred narratives that vulnerable people have so willingly entrusted me with, and carrying them to people like you, as well as to government officials and a broader public. It's how I celebrate the grassroots programs that I see that work, and really put forward the unsung heroes who are doing brave and fun and noble and often dangerous work on a daily basis. And it's how, as that scripture says, I kind of work out my own salvation every day when I try to figure out, who am I, as I try to make sense of what is often so senseless in the world. So given I keep traveling, I'm going to keep writing. If someone else will publish a book like that, whatever that looks like, I'm all for it. I did write a paper at school that was really important to me. It's a bringing together of social justice, feminism, and healing from patriarchal wounding and gender violence, and taking a look at things like the women's consciousness raising sessions of the 1970s, with some solutions that come from recovery fellowships. So that was about a 30-page paper, but I think it could pretty easily be expanded into a book with some other women, all of us looking at what our unique contribution to that model can be. And, I've got this, my husband, obviously, his racing season has started, so I like to trot around and follow him and celebrate his career. Mm-hmm. That's sort of what I do.
Did the writing, which I know you do a lot because you're traveling, do you think it helped you through the pain of your own experiences and the experiences of the people that you were visiting? Or had the therapy sort of cleaned most of that up? Is it an ongoing process?
It's definitely an ongoing process. And there's a woman about whom I write often in the book. Her name is Tenny McCarty.
Yes.
Her grandmother name is Menny, so I call her Menny. And she is a survivor of an extremely dysfunctional family system, and I have permission to tell her story. She says, "Oh, honey, you can tell my story, just get it right." She's a survivor of childhood sexual abuse, and she says that it took her about 11 years to work through the childhood sexual abuse. She would do a piece of work and then go out and celebrate recovery and live a robust and full life. And then one day she'd wake up and say, "Oh, it's time to do another piece of work." And she would go do a workshop, group up with other survivors, do anger work, do shame work. And then all of a sudden she woke up one day and she was like, "I feel pretty complete. I feel like I've done my work." And I'm only 5 years in to my own process, and I don't know how much longer it will take. I don't know ultimately what it will look like. But I'm real fortunate in that I love the work. I love sitting around with other people and getting real. And when I went to treatment, it's called Shades of Hope. Initially, I called it Shades of Hell. I hated the place. My dad and I, when we wrote back, it's in Buffalo Gap, Texas, we called it Buffalo F Gap. But eventually, I started to get relief. And the next thing I knew, I wasn't writing the F. And then I was calling it Shades of Hope. And then I was calling it the real world, because it's a place where the truth is told. Mm-hmm. And it's my hope every day that I can bring more of that truth into all of my activities.
Mm-hmm. It's very easy to avoid the truth in families. Families are known for secrets and lies and areas you don't cross this line. Your family was very interesting because you had a duality, and I really felt in some ways I was looking at a mirror in some of the things that you wrote. You had some irresponsibility on the parts of your parents, some neglect. You also had love from them, and you had incredible summers of stability and love from your grandparents, but then you knew you were going back into something that was going to be different and not as stable. How, the duality, did it make you feel somewhat schizophrenic? Were you a person who knew how to act, okay, this is how I act here, this is how I act there? What was it?
Well, eventually, when I was in my 30s, I realized that I had a real knack for finding and keeping a boyfriend for about 6 weeks. And my imagination would like to tell me that those summers with my grandparents, were 3 or 4 months. They were probably about 6 weeks. Mm-hmm. And that may be a fabrication on my part or an association that's not necessarily based in fact, but it feels to me like there's probably some resonance in there. And I'm real clear today that both my mother and my dad just absolutely loved and adored me. And we had a family system, like I said, that didn't work very well. And so the kinds of things that happen in a system that doesn't work well happen to all of us. And I think my sister said something pretty interesting yesterday. When we were much younger, because things have gotten better, fortunately for us individually and collectively, but we were sitting in a car looking out our own windows. Although we were together, we were each on our way to our own individual nightmare. And that's a pretty dark and scary statement, but it was hard, for each of us in our own way. And it's so interesting to look into family systems and how they work. And, my family wanted to make me the hero child, because if I was the hero child, then what did that mean? That I was okay, and that they didn't really have to take a look at the fact that I was not okay. They could falsely empower me and operate from this assumption that I was competent and capable and popular, and oh my gosh, I was the first sophomore elected vice president of the whole student body. I made us look good in the community. I made us look like we were okay and normal. Well, guess what? Normal is a cycle on a washing machine. And the reality was I was the lost child. And my sister a lot of times was made into the scapegoat, where she was the problem child. She was bad, wrong, and imperfect. And if she would only do... And that's where so much of my indignation came from. Because I was like, hello, she's just a kid like I am. This is not her fault. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Sometimes when you're a high achiever, again, that can mask certain things. Like I read a lot of books, but I'm like, somebody should have said, like, reading 10 books a week is probably not quite normal.
Right.
Why is this kid reading so much?
Right.
So You also talk about a trip that you took to Japan, and I thought about the fact that you had a number of caring and principled adults in your life. Piper, I believe, was one of them, and she helped you, and then the person who helped you write your, to get into college and that kind of thing. But when you went to Japan as a young woman, got an opportunity to model, there was also that whole idea of how the exploitation of women and children come out. That was an exploitative experience, and I started thinking about all the other people and how excited to become a young model, but putting young girls in what can be a bad situation. Do you want to talk about that at all?
Polaris Project is an American anti-trafficking organization. It is a really outstanding group. They operate, for example, the national tip line that the Department of Justice relies on, and it's available in multiple languages and whatnot. And I was just speaking recently with Kat Chan, the co-founder, who's a classmate of mine. They also have offices in Japan because child pornography is still legal in Japan. Mm. She was like, don't go. Because they've asked me to join their board, and I was like, well, where do you want me to go? And she's like, we'll keep you in America. You can't go to Japan. You'll be too mad. I didn't really, there was a certain age, sort of 12, 13, when part of my escapism and fantasy was through the glamour of high fashion, and my godmother, Piper, was incredibly chic. And so that became a hero worship activity of mine. I had no idea what I wanted to be. I just knew that it had to be sophisticated. Like that was pretty much the end all be all of my ambition. I did not have a lot of guidance or direction in the house. And when I had this strange opportunity to model, I mean, it's an incredibly random story, but I was at home alone one afternoon, as I most often was, and a man came knocking on the door. And we lived in the middle of nowhere. And he was from New York, and he was scouting a location that would be suitable to shoot a cigarette billboard ad. And he liked a field across the road from our house. So he knocked on the door and said, who owns that field? Is there an adult here? Have you ever thought about modeling? And I'm like, do I have a deal for you? Get in here. Invited this man into the house. I had these little informal modeling shots that my mother did. The next thing I know, I'm in freaking Tokyo, Japan by myself. Yeah. 15 years old, an unescorted minor. And the sorts of things that happen to a 15-year-old unescorted minor working for adult men who privilege their sexual interests over the sexual autonomy and bodily integrity of girls happened to me. Mm-hmm. What a shocker. And you know what's so interesting? I was really glad today that I had a little bit of time to just take a breath after this initial crush of the press. So much of what has been focused on the past few days, and it may change, was that my mom had boyfriends or something like that. Not the fact that I was raped twice when I was 15 in Japan. It's been so much about the personality of my mother rather than the principle of the fact that hurtful things happen in families that don't work well, and there is the hope and help of recovery for every single one of us.
Yes, yes. And it's not really, I think that if you talk to almost anybody here one-on-one, after a while, people have experienced some stuff. Women have experienced stuff. A lot of people when they were children, and sometimes you just gloss over it, but we're all connected in that way. I saw a video that you did introducing a speech where you talked about someone you knew in Atlanta.
Absolutely.
And because one of the things when I was reading the book is that that story wasn't in it, but when I saw the video, I thought I'm going to ask her if you don't mind sharing that, because it's not just pointing your finger across the sea at another country.
Right.
Or, well, they're not as developed as we are.
Right.
They don't have this. It really is that it exists everywhere. If you would share that story.
Well, in the United States, sexual assault happens at 20 times the rate that it does in Japan. Mm. And we have the highest instances of reported sexual assault of any country in the world that reports such figures. And of course, it is significantly underreported. And every 45 seconds in this country, a woman is sexually assaulted. And 3 women will be killed today by a partner or former partner. And we know our assailants. This whole myth that it's strangers who jump out from behind bushes is patently false. We know our assailants. The story to which was made reference is that a girl with whom I'm very close was unhappy at boarding school and had been telling her parents so in no uncertain terms, and they kept sending her back, and she did not feel it was a suitable environment for her for a variety of reasons. And so she was changing airplanes at a major American city, and she ran away. And within hours, she had been snapped up by a pimp. She was raped 10 to 15 times a day by adult perpetrators in her pimp's motel room for 5 days until she was identified by a security person at a shopping mall. And when it came time for her to provide a testimony to the FBI because they had enough evidence to start pressing charges against the pimp, this child has so not received at home what she needs. She said, no, 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 he's my friend. He took me to get a manicure. He did not hurt me. That's what neglect does.
Yes.
That's what neglect does. It gets into the cells of the body and distorts the very thinking processes of our children.
Yes, yes. And attention can look like love, even negative attention.
Absolutely.
And that was a question I had skipped over earlier, so that'll get me back to that when you say children are not for sex.
Duh.
So I want you to define how you consider children, because you see girls who happen to have women's bodies
Right.
be
Oh,
looked
you're
at
gonna be
as
mad.
though.
You're going to the thing that makes
But
me
it also
mad.
happens when the death penalty, or when they charge a person who's under 18, and they say,
Right.
well, he's trying him as an adult. Even for males, it bothers me. What is a child to you? How do you define a child?
There are multiple definitions, and there's a whole class on that at the Kennedy School, taught by Professor Jacqueline Bobbitt. It's very good. The syllabus, I'm sure, is available online. It's highly suggested reading. Let me define it from a couple of points of view. A child is vulnerable, precious, and dependent. They are also the most self-centered creatures in the world, and that's exactly as God made them to be. Mm-hmm. They need time, care, direction, appropriate protection, and they absolutely have the right to participate in their own development at the level at which they are capable. And that looks a little different for every kid. It would be easy to just do it chronologically by numbers or say according to their grade in school, but every kid is a little different. And so this 14-year-old girl, for example, one minute she is asking me to put her to bed and playing with her dolls. And the next minute she's autonomous and she's setting boundaries and she's saying, no, I want you to go because I don't want to be too reliant on you. Or one of her friends walks in the room and she's giving me that get out of here look. And the legal definition, of course, in this country is the age of 18 is the line of demarcation. In Texas, it's a child is emancipated at 17. That is a somewhat arbitrary number, but we have to have that starting point. And I've talked with a lot of girls who are victims of sexual exploitation who believe that they have consented about just this. There is no such thing as consent for a child. It doesn't matter what you say. There's no such thing as consent. And the great Andrea Dworkin said incest is boot camp for prostitution. And I expand that because any kind of sexual abuse and incest creates trauma bonding, and that sets up the psychology of compliant victimization. And that's what so often happens to girls. They become compliant victims, which just really feeds in very effortlessly to our culture of blaming girls and women for having been victims of sexual assault.
Okay. Thank you. I knew you would give us a really definitive definition.
And it's important to work the solution from multiple angles. Please tell your retailers that you don't appreciate them selling high heels for 6-year-olds.
Yes, yes.
And that the sexualization of our children is an enormous part of the problem.
Yes.
Through clothing, through the bloody cartoons, through advertising, and I've done an analysis of that kind of media, and it's so disturbing. Like the moment when the beautiful woman with the fan blowing her hair and the screen bikini spread out on a car when she's just about to take a bite of that cheeseburger, it's like it positions her in her absolutely most vulnerable moment. And then there's the entry of the consumer choice and the power and domination of the man. It's really disturbing.
And we have to be very vigilant about it. It's about time to open up for questions and answers, if anybody has any for Ms. Judd, but I had a couple things I want to ask you. I could tell you love learning and love school. There was an article in Sunday's Globe about books, and one of the gentlemen, the Mayflower book you mentioned, he wrote me a note to say he couldn't be here tonight, he's in England, and to thank you so much for mentioning his book.
Wasn't that nice?
Okay, so I'm...
Well, I can tell y'all now, because it's actually going to be on TV here in a little bit.
Yeah.
I was very fortunate to have been approached by the genealogy program, Who Do You Think You Are? And over a year ago, they started researching our entire family tree. And when they asked me what in particular I would like to know, I said, I've always wondered if there was another social reformer in the family, if there was a crusader, or did I just really come out of nowhere? Well, there is a strong legacy of social reform, justice, and in particular, faith-based activities in the family. I have 2 triple great-grandfathers who fought for the Union cause out of eastern Kentucky. One had a battlefield amputation and was prisoner of war twice. And I am a direct descendant of William and Mary Brewster, who came over on the Mayflower. So I be Yankee, in spite of myself. And William Brewster in particular was one of the first Puritans. He was imprisoned for attempting to practice his faith. He was charged with sedition and eventually treason. He tried to flee England for religious freedom and was jailed for that. And he was just a really great rabble-rouser. I mean, world-class rabble-rouser. And he was the spiritual father of the community.
Yep, yep.
Very cool.
Well, that was interesting to find out because you have 8 generations in Kentucky, right?
Yes, lots and lots in eastern Kentucky.
Okay, so let's get to some questions. I'll start here and I'll go back and forth. Yes.
All right, it's an honor to meet you. My name is Bill Warden.
Hi, Bill.
I just wanted to say everything you do is good, and I appreciate it, and keep up the good work. Nice to meet you. Thank you.
Thanks very much
Thank
for
you.
coming.
Yes.
Nice to meet you too, and
Nice to meet you.
share the.
What's your
Kentucky.
name?
My name's Gary.
Nice to meet
Spent some time in Kentucky, Lexington, Kentucky. So, nice to finally have a chance to meet you. I wanted to ask you a little bit about your spirituality and how that connects with prayer and God and injustice.
Right.
And how do you reconcile those, as well as the whole issue of grief over the great injustice that we see, whether that's the raping of children or murders, and how do you hold a spiritual base with all of that, with all the facts of how we end up treating each other in this world, and really the unthinkable atrocities that have happened all over the world.
I'm feeling you, Gary. I know. I know. It's a question I ask all the time, and it's really just a process. And that's why I said earlier, it is very simple, but it is not easy. And I'm really grateful for the days when I do have it semi-straight in my head. What I've been taught and what is working for me at present is that it's really my responsibility to have some kind of conscious contact with a God of my own understanding. And that looks like different things on different days. And in my conscious contact, I'm asked to ask only for knowledge of God's will for me. Whatever God's will for you is really none of my business. And I really can't do much about what you do, but if I put that focus on myself and I let it begin with me and I take responsibility for myself, my own attitudes and actions, and I ask for the power to carry out that will. So it's 2 parts. What is the will, and please grant me the power? I just do the next good, right, honest thing and let go of the outcome. And there's a lot about that in the Bhagavad Gita. Do the next good, right, honest thing and let go of the outcome. And as a friend of mine says it, I'm not responsible for the whole pattern. I am responsible to take the next stitch. And grief, being able to identify the stages of grief has been really helpful for me in my process. Denial, anger, bargaining, the dark night of the soul, and finally acceptance. And as soon as I recognize the stage I'm in, it doesn't necessarily make it go away, but it just gives me a little psychic space to remember that it is a process, and this too shall pass. And then just love, 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 love.
Yeah.
Thanks, Gary.
Thank you
Very
very
good.
much.
Thank you.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Chris Coonahan. I'm from Cambridge. Ms. Judd, welcome back.
Thanks, Chris.
And thank you for your stories of recovery and carrying spirituality into the world. And I was curious, you mentioned Thomas Merton and Gandhi, and I'm wondering if you had similar connections with other people's spirituality in other parts of the world, because I think it's very important, and it's kind of something we don't talk about. There's a lot of conflict about whose God is better in the world, but you're seeming to make a connection between everybody's God. So I'm wondering if you can share other spiritual practices and solutions that people found in some of the darker places of the world that you've been to.
Amazingly, the temples, I mean, isn't that a really interesting slip? The brothels of Mumbai are like temples. They are filled with religious iconography, with incense, lighting of candles at certain times of the day, wonderful images of Ganesh and Shiva. It's remarkable the role that faith plays in keeping people, just a half step ahead of complete and total hopelessness. And Archbishop Tutu is a great spiritual hero of mine. Sometimes people are like, gosh, don't you love Madiba? And I'm like, well, of course I love Nelson Mandela. But because of my special connection with him as a younger woman, we were friends with South Africans who were about to be placed under house arrest. They were in the music business in South Africa, and they fled to Nashville, Music City, USA. And they brought with them LP records of some of Father Tutu's speeches. And that's how I was introduced to the reality of apartheid and spiritual nonviolent resistance. And he definitely is someone that I reach out to a lot. In my last sort of bout of despair when I was in Congo recently, he said, God loves you because you're hurting. God loves you because you're in anguish. God loves you because you give a shit, excuse my language, and because you're so foolish to do so. You're just right where you're supposed to be.
Yeah.
And then I really love Native American spirituality too. That's something that I look to a lot. And I just have a very broad, ecumenical, inclusive faith. So yay me.
Thank you.
I'll get your question, but you did say something, I remember in the book, that sometimes you do have to get back to the faith that you
Yes.
grew up in, that really is becomes your centering point again, even though you're open, ecumenical,
Yes.
your specific faith, right?
Yeah, and I come from a Protestant Christian tradition, and it's really important to me. But I'm very lucky that, the key people for me in that world, like my Uncle Mark, who is a Southern Baptist minister, and is now moving along within that congregation a more progressive trajectory, because he does think that women should be deacons and whatnot. Someone asked me to read wives submit to your husbands at their wedding. It's like a really bad idea. And I was so upset. I mean, I was very young. I was just sobbing my head off. And Uncle Mark, he pulled the car over, and I thought, here comes the lecture. And he just said, Ashley, I love you. It was just such an act of mercy, So.
Yes. Yes.
You mentioned Andre Agassi's book, Open.
Mm-hmm.
It's very interesting. In the midst of his joy with Stevie having the first child, he mentions, my name's Kevin, by the way, he mentions the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Now, you know that at Pentecost, the Holy Ghost appeared over our Blessed Mother and the apostles in the form of tongues of fire. Now, these tongues of fire, my dear, purify all human relationships, in marriage,
Okay.
out, whether relationships are voluntary, involuntary. In other words, the tongue of fire
Is there a question, sir?
descends upon you, and you're whole.
Okay.
My name is Kevin Harrington. It's wonderful seeing you. And all I'm saying is, the Lord does not send perfect people to do his work, but we grow as we help others.
Thank you so much.
Thank you,
very
Kevin.
much.
Nice
Yes.
to meet you.
Hi, Ashley. I'm Natasha.
Hi, Natasha.
Nice to see you. 2 questions, actually. I recently graduated with a graduate degree in global public health. So women's health issues are really high on my priority in terms of career step. But I'm curious as to why you decided to go to Kennedy. And also, in the realm of being in the public eye, being a celebrity, how do you see the whole advocacy, celebrity advocacy going in the future in terms of writing books or traveling, etc., to address maternal health issues abroad, especially family planning? And I'm really familiar with the work of PSI, and they're amazing. Just curious as to how someone like yourself can project this into the future and include a whole other generation of younger women who are interested in participating in this.
Well, let me put on my board of directors PSI hat. We have employment opportunities listed on psi.org. Really encourage you to check it out.
I have.
Good. Well, I always wanted to go to graduate school. I thought I would probably go in anthropology. I had almost joined the Peace Corps in 1990. And once I got into recovery and just things started to straighten out in a way that felt really good, I thought, it's time. So I went over to Vanderbilt and visited with a professor I know there. And he had done his due diligence and had all these suggestions about other profs with whom I visit. And just as I was preparing to leave, he said, "Why aren't you going to Harvard?" To which I replied, "Why am I not putting a rocket ship up my ass and going to the moon?" It was just what blurted out of my mouth.
Very direct you are.
And he was like, "No, seriously." And then he asked me if I asked certain people what graduate program would be best for me. And they were literally my friends and my colleagues, but it had never occurred to me to ask them. I had just not integrated yet the idea that graduate school would actually be a part of feminist social justice work. It was just the holdover dream from when I was 22 and wanted to go to the University of Chicago in anthropology. So anyway, I went home and I emailed one of my spiritual mentors, and she was like, "Oh, you have to look at the Women in Public Policy program at the K School." Started to cry, thought, these are my people, this is very exciting, found the link to the Carr Center for Human Rights. There's a board member at PSI who's one of the first women to graduate from Harvard Law, so I talked with her. And the next thing I knew, I was on the phone with them, and they were like actually recruiting me. Boy, did that feel good. And it was the right place. Gloria Steinem tried to talk me out of it. She said they can't organize their way out of a paper bag. But I liked I studied the faculty directory, and I saw people like Marshall Gans and the gentleman who directs Harvard, Hillel, and I thought this is just going to be wonderful, and it was. I absolutely loved it. And then in terms of carrying the message of advocacy to the next generation, it's a really good question. I haven't thought about it that much. I guess I'm just focused on doing my piece and what's right in front of me. And so it's a really good question, and I don't really have an answer, and I thank you very much for bringing it up. Let's radicalize the next generation.
Let's let other people.
Can I make a quick comment about that? Just as a quick comment in terms of the younger generation, it is difficult for us and young women my age and girls to actually be really interested in those issues, but then have an outlet. So I'll leave that to you.
Thank you very much. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is David Spigel. I'm an Eastern Kentuckian as well.
Hi, David. What county?
Floyd County.
Floyd County in the house.
And my cousin lives in Boyd County.
Right on.
One of the things that interested me earlier in your career was the idea that your sister and your mother were so famous, and I thought you must have had such incredible self-esteem to then think lightning would strike twice, to go to Hollywood and have your own career. And I wonder if you really thought that was going to happen.
It didn't occur to me that it wouldn't. I don't really know what that says about me, but that's a real honest answer.
Do you think that was related to self-esteem? Because what you've been talking about tonight would raise that.
You know, I was always told that I was special. My mother always told me that I was special. And I guess there was that sense in the house, too, given their dream to sing, that we were somehow different. And so I guess I just thought that unusual things happen to different people. And, you know, the acting was something that I started at a really young age. I didn't know that's what I was doing, but I look back now with the definition of acting that I have, which is to live truthfully under imaginary circumstances. And I realized I was acting all the time. You know, I'd read a book and put it down and think, okay, now I'm going to walk around like the girl in the book. I'm going to experience life as she would. I'm going to have a different set of things will affect me as they would affect her in her circumstances in the book. And that's just really acting, you know. And my anger was not welcome in the house, and I had rather a lot of things about which to be angry, so I'd close the door and tear shit, and then I'd put it all back together. Well, that's what the set decorator does. So I was just crewing my own little show in there.
Okay. Thank you for your question. Yes.
Hi, thank you, Ms. Judd. My name is Tino Capobianco. I'm a second semester senior here at Suffolk and vice president of Suffolk Democrats. I am legitimately scared of the corporate right, the Tea Party, Sarah Palin, you name it. With that being said, I think you're the polar opposite of that, and I was wondering if you ever considered running for public office.
I'm a write-in candidate for everything in Kentucky, including basketball coach until John Calipari came along. So other people have thought of that too. Well, good luck with your academic career. Keep up your good work with the Democrat organization on campus. And I have thought about it. I don't know that it's the best use of me. It is my earnest wish to be useful to my fellows. And right now, I think what that looks like in my life is working pretty well. And I think it's really important that women step forward. Hillary was the line. She was the line.
First person I ever voted for.
Isn't that great?
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, I appreciate the encouragement and am honored by your confidence in me. And it's something that I'm keeping in mind. I have a little television series to do for a while first, but we'll see where it takes me. And have you thought about running for office?
I want to someday. I interned for the Speaker of the House of Massachusetts, so I plan on running for something someday.
Good
Thank
for
you
you.
Thank you.
Good for you.
Next.
Hi, I'm Jana Wilkinson. I live here in Somerville, but I'm actually originally from Utah. And I recently graduated a year and a half, 2 years ago with a degree in social work. And I'm currently applying to get a master's in emergency and disaster management, which
Great.
I only tell you that for, I guess, a little background. Unfortunately, most education in public service is expensive, and there's not much funding or scholarships towards those programs. And then also finding a job afterwards was really difficult because unfortunately my senior year was when they started doing budget cuts. And the first thing to go when they cut budgets is a lot of nonprofit or a lot of social service programs. So now applying for graduate school, I'm kind of in the position of trying to make the decision of a program that's really good, but probably more expensive than I could afford. And then also you get the question of when you get a job afterwards, do you work for an organization you really care about that can't pay you, or do you go for a job that can help you pay off your student loans? Okay. So in that little dilemma, I just bring up the question. You mentioned earlier your comment about writing to your retailers to say you don't appreciate them selling things you don't agree with. If you're in a position that you want to be an activist and want to help, but you don't have the monetary support to either donate money to organizations or to travel to places yourself, which I have been able to do. I've worked a lot in Haiti, I've worked in Ghana, I've done a lot of work that I absolutely love, but unfortunately can't.
Get to the question.
Sorry, rambling on when I get nervous.
Yes.
What are some things, like you mentioned, writing to retailers, things that you can do if you don't have the money or means to travel?
I would never pretend like in this moment I could give you some sound and wise advice. This is your life. This is your heart. It's your academic career. It's your desire to be of service. And do you have a mentor? And this is something for you to think about. I would really encourage you to find some people who have what you want and to ask them to give you the gift of their mentorship and their time. And it doesn't have to be a lot of people. And don't get your sensitive little feelings hurt and get all discouraged if the first couple say no. But find someone who has what you want and ask them how they're doing it. And that's what we have to do. We have to group up with other human beings with whom we share our values and ask them to trudge this path with us. And good luck to you.
Oh, thank you.
I'm going to do a brief commercial again. Buy the book. Wisdom, a lot of wisdom from this woman. A lot of wisdom, a lot of clarity. Yes, sir.
My name is Michael Rafferty, and I bought the book.
Thanks, Michael.
And I'm going to get directly to my question, but first I want to thank you for making the movie Helen.
Yes.
It's one of the most realistic and crushing stories about depression. And it strikes me that that's such a personal kind of kind of issue and challenge to deal with. And I'm listening to your talk tonight, and I'm reading the book, and there's Nicholas Kristof in his prologue. And he says, humanitarians fed fatalism by focusing relentlessly on the world's problems and ignoring its successes. Are there successes? Do you feel like there's been successes?
There are successes. I love the teaching from the Talmud that when we save one, we save the whole. And I have a real firm belief that no one is disposable. And public health organizations measure their impact in years of healthy life added to individuals. So for a case of diarrheal disease that's prevented, or a case of malaria that's prevented, when we reduce maternal morbidity and mortality, those are years of healthy life that are added. And of course, within those years of healthy life, there is productivity given to society. And PSI has added literally billions of years of healthy lives to the folks that it's been serving in the past 40 years. Those are successes. You know, every year of healthy life added is a success. And yes, I do think that there are. For some reason, the Hope for Congo campaign came to mind, the initiative to educate Americans about the connection between all the electronics that we buy and gender violence in Congo. And so there's a certification scheme underway, similar to the Blood Diamond contract. So whenever you buy your next electronic, you can choose between an electronics company that has not sourced its tin, tantalum, and tungsten violently, and one, whatever I just said, I lost track. You know what I mean. You can buy it you can buy it extracted through conflict or conflict-free. And that is an impending success, but it takes everyone in rooms like this going to Hope for Congo and signing the petition and, you know, harassing their lawmakers and saying it's one thing that all companies listed on the stock exchange now trace and audit where their minerals come from. We want the certification too. That will be a huge success that you can be a part of.
Thank you. Yes.
Hi, I'm Stephen Bellick, and as a public health worker and male-embodied feminist, I'm really proud of the work that you've been doing as humanitarians. Thank you so much. I wanted to take the question in terms of, I'm curious if you struggled, at least spiritually, with being a person of privilege, being financial privilege, white privilege, and now an Ivy League educated privilege, in doing the empowering and not sympathizing work of social justice.
Well, it's a critical distinction, the distinction between pity and justice, between doing for others what they really can and should do for themselves, and where am I getting my good feelings about myself from? What is my motive here? And really what we're out to do is build self-efficacy and self-reliance. It is about those Gandhian principles of the individual increasing their self-efficacy. And there is a time for triage. There is a time when we must carry others because they're incapable of walking. And something that I see often, particularly in women survivors of gender violence, is the isolated victim who does not have fellowship and does not have connection yet with a community of fellow survivors. And the story may be absolutely identical, but she's traumatized and shut down. And I mean that literally, like unable to connect with any kind of vocalization, you know, very hopeless. And yet that same woman with the same story, connected with fellow survivors, is ululating and slapping her sisters on the back and throwing clay around as they're doing their, you know, income generation activity. And she can't, sometimes it takes other people, even outsiders like me, to help her break her isolation and connect her with her fellow survivors. But then it's really up to them, you know, to rebuild their society and carry the movement forward. Does that answer your question?
Sure. I didn't have an expectation, but thank you.
Okay, thank you.
But you make a really good point, you know, and there is a difference between, you know, charity and pity. I think I may have said that wrong. The distinction is between charity and justice and pity and empathy. We need less of the former and more of the latter.
If I may say a little thought that came to me is that I've learned that privilege never gives itself up, and you can't. You don't have to make excuses about where you've come from or the skin that you're in, which we didn't choose. but you can be of service wherever you stand. And I'm impressed that so many people you read sometimes have incredible wealth who don't seem to share or don't share publicly. Maybe they're doing a lot behind. So I don't think people should ever stop at feeling. Sometimes people say, I won't help because it might be interpreted the wrong way, and then this person is not helped. So I respect what you're doing, and thank you for bringing up that question. Yes.
Yes, I wanted to ask if you could speak to basically the challenges of creating change for women's issues in a society that shuns feminism, shuns women's issues while pretending that everything's okay on the domestic front. We tend to focus on giving aid abroad, investing in girls abroad, and yet we don't invest in girls domestically. And I was just wondering if you could speak to those dichotomies.
It's frustrating. It's really, really frustrating, you know. And as I said earlier, 3 women will die today at the hands of their partners or former partners, and yet we don't think we have a gender violence problem in this country. And all I can do is continue in the ways that are accessible to me, is be a part of the solution. There's a professor at the law school named Diane Rosenfeld who started to write legislation that has been passed in several states, including recently Kentucky, that requires GPS monitoring for batterers, because she wrote this phenomenal and pivotal article about why, when a woman is aggressed upon, why is her freedom of movement constrained? Why does she tick off the boxes about where she wants to go and be safe on certain nights of the week and certain times of the day, when her batterer has no such constraints on his liberty and movement? You know, why are they called battered women's shelters? Why aren't they called male violence shelters? So bring that up in your community. You know, my godmother has a pig. She's a fancy lady in San Francisco, and she has a pig. And some of her friends are like, that is weird. And she says, don't talk about my pig, it's my pig. So it's become a little expression for me that we each have to find our pig. We have to find what our little thing is that we're frankly defensive about, you know, that's connected to our soul, and then leverage your soul. That is the toughest journey we ever take, the longest 18 inches we travel from the head to the heart. But when they're connected, my God, we're powerful.
Yes, thank you. Next.
I hope in the madness those last 2 weeks you still got to watch UK in the tournament.
Of course I did.
Okay. The world is still okay. My question is a good follow-up. How do you think you can take the morals and lessons you've learned abroad and bring them to Appalachia, which you know is so near and dear to my heart, near and dear to your heart, obviously?
Well, for me, the focus in Appalachia, and there, as I used this expression earlier, there are a lot of levers that can be pushed in Appalachia too. For me, the important one right now is the urgent need to stop detonating our mountains and to stop mountaintop removal coal mining immediately. And the mineral exploitation in that area has led for over 100 years to poor health outcomes, poor educational attainment, extraordinary isolation of communities. And if we can do something about the coal companies and then bring some diversification to the local economies, there can be some real improvements in the short and long term. And I'm glad that you brought it up. It's a part of the country that's really important to me.
Thank you. Yes.
Hi, good evening, Ms. Judd. My name is Pat. I'm a junior at Suffolk. And my question tonight is your advice about guilt. And it's kind of, I think as young people and just Americans in general, we learn, how much bad things are going on in the world and how lucky we are not, to have what we do have. And also sometimes the U.S. involvement in those bad things. So what would your advice be to make sure that guilt makes us not unable to help others? Because sometimes I think when we feel guilty, we just shut off and say, well, I can't do anything about this, and I feel so bad about what I do have that I'm not going to change anything.
That is such a good question. Well, it's interesting. Manny has taught me about guilt and shame. Shame is when I'm ashamed of who I am or who I erroneously think I am. And guilt is my bad feelings about myself and what I think I've done. So that's the difference between guilt and shame. And every feeling has its dark side. And the dark side comes if I don't process the feeling, if it's carried or denied, or if I'm doing somebody else's guilt for them. Have you ever done somebody else's guilt for them? Like they do something, they have bad manners at the table and you feel guilt, right? I did some anger work recently about the girl that I was mentioning earlier who was pimped, and my husband said, get a few good whacks in for me. And I said, I will not. You have to do your own anger work. I will not do your anger for you. And so on the other side of feelings, there are gifts. And the gift of guilt is amends and values. And there is such a thing as healthy guilt. The unhealthy is when I'm paralyzed. Gosh, I'm actually one of those speakers who has to take a drink of water from time to time.
Yeah, me too. You want some of mine? You want me to pour some in your cup?
And I'm not useful to anybody if I'm paralyzed. But the gifts of guilt are amends and values. I live my amends and I live my values. And the gifts of shame are humility and humanity, where I'm right-sized. I'm neither greater than nor lesser than. So I would support you to do some writing about your guilt and just try to figure out, is it yours or are you carrying somebody else's? Write about what your values are. You may not be real clear about them, but what do you aspire to? And then go out and take some action.
Thank you. Sound advice, and now a final question.
Hi, Ashley. My name's Michael O'Loughlin. I'd like to thank you for coming to Suffolk University tonight. I'm a proud graduate of Suffolk Law School, and I work down the street at the Boston Municipal Court. When I was in college, I attended an event like this, and we had two speakers that year. One was Oliver North, and one was Reverend Jesse Jackson. And as a college senior, I don't remember anything that Oliver North said, but I'll never forget that. I'll never forget Reverend Jackson's closing words to us were, "Keep hope alive." And I was thinking, as I listened to you talk about such horrible things, what are the ways that how you deal with that, but how do you keep hope alive for yourself and for those people around you?
That's a really good question. I'm not real sure that I have an answer. How do I keep hope alive? Every time I go through the process, whatever the process is, whether it's the grief process or the breakdown, feeling despair and really overwhelmed by having spent the day with teenagers who are survivors of multiple gang rapes, all of whom were pregnant by their rapists. When I go through that process and then have the breakthrough, my hope is reborn. And in particular, your question brings to mind the story of a girl I met named Solange. She is so beautiful and very bashful. She would hold my hand and put her head on my shoulder and then remember herself and feel overcome with shyness and turn away. But then the physical comforting and the nurturing was just irresistible to her, and she would turn her head back. She was just precious. And I asked her what I could do for her in addition to what was being done for her at the Heal Africa Clinic in Goma. And she said that she would really like to have help having her primary needs met. She'd been brought in as a recently gang raped girl with just the clothes on her back. And she didn't have a toothbrush. She didn't even have the ubiquitous plastic, pail that you see all over Africa in which to store belongings because she didn't have any. So I said, well, why don't I take you to the store? And it was so funny because the gentleman who was with me, Fidel, who's just lovely and speaks the local dialect, he said she won't want to go to the supermarché. It's way too overwhelming. And I said, would you like to go to the supermarché? And she said, yes, I want to go to the supermarché. And of course, the supermarché was something out of like Lonely Planet Traveler's Guide, this absolutely cavernous outdoor market with all these stalls. And, there's not a whole lot of sense of personal boundaries and space in that part of Africa. I mean, we had 54 little kids following us everywhere we went as soon as we got there. And I turned into the directive auntie and would not let her buy the skin lightening cream soap. The bastards. But we got her toothpaste and toothbrush and all those other essentials. And then I walked her over to where those beacons of hope, the African girls' school uniform, is sold. Those wonderful blue skirts with the white tops with the little Peter Pan collar. And I said, Solange, why don't we get you some school things? And she just froze. She was absolutely paralyzed. She wouldn't even make eye contact with me. And I was like, Solange, come on, I have to catch a boat to Bukavu. Let's get your school stuff. And she said, I'll never go to school. And I said to her, I don't know if you will ever go to school. And that is not ultimately to be decided today. But do today you have the hope? Do you have the dream that you could go to school? And she said, yes, I do. And I said, well, then why don't we do the next good, right, honest thing and take the action that is in front of us to take and get you the skirt, get you the top, get you the pens and the composition notebooks, and a rucksack to put it all in. And that wonderful smile bloomed again on her face. And we got her her gear. And I'm very happy to tell you that today Solange is in fact in school.
Great, thank you.
And with every year of education an African girl gets, it delays the birth of her first child. It helps prevent her being forced into child marriage. It helps her have fewer children and space them better. It allows her, obviously, to get the education that can help her access some vocational and income-generating activities. It makes a big difference, a year of school.
Okay. As we end, and you are going to sign people's books, I wanted to know, is there anything that you'd like to share with people that we haven't asked you a question about or discussed tonight?
I would just say that you matter. You know, you matter. And we're either a part of the solution or we are a part of the problem. There really is no in-between. And one of the most powerful moments I've ever had in my trip was with a woman named Kika, who, when I asked her how she had survived the gender violence she'd endured, she said, well, when I got to the clinic, they didn't abandon me. And when I didn't get well quickly, they still did not abandon me. And when I wasn't able to go home because the area was still violent, they did not abandon me. And I remember that every day. And so the question for me becomes, am I going to abandon her? And what about you?
Thank you very much.
I'd like to thank our moderator, Candelaria Silva, and our fantastic guest, Ashley Judd. Thank you so much for coming to the forum. Go ahead, give me another hand. If you enjoyed tonight's free program, become a member of the forum. Ms. Judd will now walk over to the Fort Hall Forum table right over there and sign books. We need people who want signatures to line up right here and come up the stairs. You can still buy books out in the lobby.